Do this without the box. Jackson Young has been part of our UU community for about 10 years. He was part of the coming of age cohort this last spring. He'll be entering 10th grade at John Marshall Senior High School this year. And this was his second year at a UU Summer Leadership School, and he's here to share with us this morning his experience. Welcome, Jackson.
Good morning, all. My name is Jackson Young, and during the last week of July, I attended a UU seminar called Thrive, a gathering of UU-associated youth of color brought together to learn about leadership, social justice, and in turn, deepening our faith. I first heard about Thrive from a school called MWS, which stood for the UU Midwestern Leadership School, which is based in Beloit, Wisconsin. I had the joy of attending last year's class with many different people, including a few youth from our own church. As one of the 2 persons of color attending that year, we were encouraged by adult facilitators to attend Thrive for not only a reinforcement of leadership skills we learned that week, but to meet more youth of color in our faith, a fairly rare resource not just found in the Midwest. We both left the school interested in attending, and after rethinking my interests and talks with family and our church, I was ready to attend this Thrive to represent our church at the Eastern Variant hosted by the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Annapolis, Maryland. Sometime around 4 months before my pilgrimage, I was invited to a Thrive Facebook group containing general status updates, shares about social justice Facebook posts, but most importantly, to me at least, much deductible information from which I can learn about this mysterious Thrive. Around 20 people were in the group, which was slightly smaller than the Midwestern school I attended. Also, the other youth of color and 1 adult were in the group too, which I found interesting. The person who invited me into the group was the Reverend Elizabeth Nguyen, the UUA Leadership Development Associate for Youth and Young Adults of Color. The mastermind behind both Thrives, she unfortunately couldn't come to either due to a busy schedule, but she would bestow her generosity to us in the form of paying for Chinese and Indian takeout, which was much well received. The group was from all over the country, although I could not figure out who would all be going to the Eastern Thrive with me. One observable thing that did stand out to me was the diversity of the people in the group. Although I knew the term person of color applies to many different backgrounds, I couldn't help but notice being one of the few black people in the group. From various photos I found, I was most likely the only one who didn't come from mixed parents, which led me to joke around with a few people I would be the blackest person going to this. The coffee with a bit of cream, surrounded by creams with a bit of coffee. That's when I knew I was about to have an experience of a lifetime. Thrive shattered my expectations of the type of people who would be going before it even started, in turn revealing a prejudice I've always had but never noticed. I waited in even more anticipation than before for July to come. My waiting eventually paid off when I realized that when I came to the Annapolis church for the first time. A modest church with a beautiful outside area, I met an equally as beautiful, diverse group of youth and adults I would come to be close with for 5 days. I was not, indeed, the blackest person there. Over the week, we learned more about each other than any 2-second judgment from a Facebook picture could ever tell. Heritage-wise, about 8, and this is just out of the 10 youth that were there, had black ancestors, while 7 had white ancestry. 4 of us had Hispanic parents, but none of us specifically identified as Hispanic, which was also another thing I found very interesting. Some of us were adopted as well, which brought out a mix of different feelings in people. Some of the stories shared made both the teller and the listeners uncomfortable, and personally, I thought that was okay. We were real, raw, and honest with one another, and that quickly created a bond like no other for as long as time can try it. Our days there were filled with lessons, eating meals, worship, and social time anytime between those. The topics of interest generally revolved around race. Some examples were the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality, cultural exchange versus appropriation, and many others that were discussed for the purpose of monitoring how we interacted within not only our own congregations at home, but communicating with people in general. After that, we made a sort of altar that we would use for our worships that we had at night. Before we came to the church, we were asked to bring something that had a sort of significance to our family that represented our ancestors. While we were there, we explained the significance to each other and then placed them on the table to create that altar. We used it as a centerpiece for the worship time, and our worship was about an hour long every night. Each one was planned and acted out by different delegated groups made up to 3 or 4 people. They were creative, intriguing, and thoughtful, and sources used to pull content varied from the traditional UU hymnals to the somewhat untraditional Dr. Seuss. Everyone played a role, and no one took charge of too much or too little. In our free time, when we weren't talking about combating social injustice and Netflix, the favorite chosen pastime was art, particularly drawing, as a creative outlet to express our feelings. Our adult facilitators soon figured this out too, and every morning would begin with us all drawing on one piece of paper how we felt the previous day went. Eventually, the paper sped out to be bigger than 2 arm lengths, and at the end of Thrive, we all did one final drawing on how we feel our last day would go. From my message today, the importance of that week to me may not have come through as well as I wanted to, so before I end, I want to clarify. Thrive not only strengthened my integrity as a person of color, but also deepened my faith as a UU, being able to learn, dine, laugh, feel with, worship, and understand these relative strangers that are somewhat similar to me, been through the similar of what I've experienced, and that's meant a lot to me. I hope the way it's changed me can better the way I interact with this church, my church as well. Thank you.